The whip cracked across his back for the 47th time that morning, and Tamati didn't scream. He couldn't. Not anymore. The alpha standing above him, Rengi of the Crimson Fong pack, wanted him to break, wanted him to beg, but Tamati had learned long ago that begging only made it worse. His mother had taught him that before they killed her, stay silent, survive. That was all a slave could do in the world of wolves. If this story grips your soul, hit that subscribe button right now. And tell me the city you're watching from so I can send you a hug. You're about to witness a transformation that defies every law of our kind. Tamati was born in chains. Not metaphorical ones. Actual iron chains that his mother wore around her ankles until the day she died giving birth to him. The midwives said it was a miracle he survived at all. Slave mothers rarely lived through childbirth in the Crimson Fong territory, and their children lived even shorter lives. But Tamati's mother, Aroha, had whispered something to him in those final moments, something the witnesses couldn't quite hear, something that seemed to make the baby's eyes flash with an impossible silver light before fading back to their dull brown. The Crimson Fong pack controlled the territories around what the old ones called Otapoti, the steep place, before the colonizers renamed it. It was a land of brutal beauty, where mountains met the sea and wolves ran free under stars that seemed close enough to touch. But Tamati never ran free. He was property. Less than property. He was the son of a slave, which made him lower than the lowest omega, lower than dirt, lower than the parasites that fed on dirt. Alpha Rengi made sure everyone knew it. Every single day. Tamati couldn't shift. That was the curse of slave-born wolves. Whatever magic ran through the bloodlines of true pack members, it skipped over slaves entirely. While other young wolves experienced their first transformation at puberty, feeling their bones reshape and their senses explode into primal awareness, Tamati remained stubbornly, painfully human. Weak. Vulnerable. Worthless. He was 17 now, and every day without a transformation was another day of mockery. The pack's young warriors, barely older than him, would circle him in the training grounds, shifting in and out of their wolf forms just to show him what he'd never have. Hemi was the worst of them, Alpha Rengi's eldest son, a brute with a silver-streaked pelt and his father's cruel streak multiplied tenfold. "Look at him," Hemi would laugh, his voice distorting as he shifted halfway, his face elongating into a muzzle while keeping his human vocal cords. "The little slave thinks he's people. Should we tell him what happened to his whore mother? Should we tell him how she screamed?" Tamati learned to take it. He had no choice. Fighting back meant death, and something deep inside him, some stubborn core of defiance he couldn't name, refused to die. Not yet. Not like this. His days began before dawn. He'd wake in the slave quarters, a rotting lean-to behind the packhouse where 12 other broken souls huddled for warmth. He'd fetch water from the stream, haul wood for the fires, scrub the floors of the great hall where free wolves feasted on meat he'd never tasted. He'd polish the silver ceremonial daggers used in pack rituals, his scarred hands trembling with exhaustion, his stomach hollow with hunger. And every night, he'd look up at the moon and wonder why he was still alive. The pack's territory centered around the Great Hall in Otapoti, but their influence stretched for miles in every direction, encompassing the smaller settlements that dotted the coastline. To the north, the mountains rose like jagged teeth, home to the Highland pack who viewed the Crimson Fong as beneath them. To the south, the coastal reavers controlled the fishing grounds, a vicious group who settled disputes with blood rather than words. And to the west, beyond the forests, lay the territory of the Silver Moon Pack, spoken of in whispers and legends. The Silver Moon Pack supposedly descended from the first wolves, the original children of the moon goddess herself. Their alpha was said to be chosen not by strength or birthright, but by the moon herself, marked with silver eyes that could see into souls. Most dismissed it as folklore, old stories told by grandmothers to entertain cubs. But Tamati's mother had believed. In her final moments, with her blood soaking the straw beneath her, she'd gripped his infant hand and whispered, "The moon sees you, my son. When all others look away, she sees you." He'd heard the story from Marama, one of the older slaves who'd been present at his birth. She told him on his 10th birthday. The same day Alpha Rengi had burned the number 7 into his shoulder with a hot iron, marking him as property of the 7th house. Marama had wept as she told him, her weathered hands shaking. Your mother knew things, Marama had said. Old things. Moon things. The Alpha feared her, though he'd never admit it. That's why he worked her so hard while she was with child. He wanted you dead before you were born. But Aroha was strong. Stronger than any of us knew. Tamati carried that story like a secret ember in his chest. When the whips fell, when the kicks landed, when Hemi and his cronies cornered him in the dark and hurt him in ways that left no visible marks, he'd touch his chest and feel that ember still burning. He didn't know what it meant. He didn't know if it meant anything at all. But it kept him alive. The winter of his 17th year was particularly brutal. Snow covered the mountains, and cold winds howled down from the peaks, turning the settlement into a frozen hellscape. Slaves weren't given winter clothes. They wore the same threadbare rags in summer and winter alike, and if they froze to death in the night, well, there were always more slaves to replace them. Tamati survived by stealing. Little things. Potato from the kitchen. A scrap of wool from the weaving room. A forgotten cloak left by the fire. He was good at being invisible, at moving through spaces like smoke. The free wolves barely saw him anyway, their eyes sliding past him as if he were part of the furniture. It was a kind of curse and a kind of gift. But his luck ran out on the night of the first full moon of winter. He'd snuck into the great hall after the feast, hoping to find scraps left on the tables. The pack had celebrated something, he didn't know what, and they'd eaten like kings. Surely they'd left something behind, some bone with meat on it, some crust of bread, anything to quiet the gnawing hunger in his belly. He was wrong. The hall was picked clean. But as he turned to leave, he saw it. The ceremonial cloak of the Alpha, draped over the high chair, lined with fur and woven with silver thread. It would keep someone warm through 10 winters. It was also strictly forbidden for anyone but the Alpha to touch. Tamati knew better. He absolutely knew better. But the cold had seeped so deep into his bones that he couldn't think straight anymore. His fingers were numb. His lips were blue. He was going to die if he spent another night in the slave quarters without something warm. He took the cloak. He made it as far as the doorway before the alarm horn sounded. They caught him before he reached the slave quarters, 6 warriors in full wolf form circling him like death itself. He didn't run. There was no point. He simply stood there, clutching the cloak, waiting for the inevitable. Alpha Rengi arrived moments later, still in his feast clothes, his face purple with rage. Behind him, Hemi grinned with anticipation. You dare! Rengi's voice was barely human, distorted by the fury that made his eyes flash yellow. You dare touch what is mine! Tamati said nothing. He'd learned that silence was the only defense he had. He should be executed, Hemi said eagerly. Immediately. Make an example of him. But Rengi held up a hand, a cruel smile spreading across his face. No. Execution is too quick. Too merciful. This slave needs to learn his place. Strip him. Tie him to the post in the center of the settlement. Let him hang there through the full moon. If he survives until dawn, maybe I'll let him live. They ripped the cloak from his hands. They tore his clothes from his body. They dragged him to the punishment post, a thick column of wood in the center of the settlement where the pack gathered for ceremonies and judgments. They tied his wrists above his head, pulled so tight that his shoulders screamed in protest, his toes barely touching the frozen ground. And then they left him there, naked in the winter night, to die slowly while the full moon rose overhead. The first hour was agony. The cold attacked every inch of exposed skin like knives. Tamati's teeth chattered so violently he thought they'd shatter. His muscles spasmed and cramped. He couldn't feel his fingers or toes anymore. Ice formed in his hair, on his eyelashes, on the dried blood from where the ropes had cut into his wrists. The second hour he started to drift. The cold became distant, almost pleasant. His mind wandered to memories of his mother, to Marama's stories, to dreams of running free in a world where chains didn't exist. The third hour he started to see things. Shadows that moved without bodies. Lights that danced at the edges of his vision. Voices that whispered in languages he'd never learned but somehow understood. And then she appeared. The woman walked out of the moonlight itself, her form shimmering and translucent, neither fully solid nor fully spirit. She was tall, impossibly beautiful, with hair that flowed like liquid silver and eyes that held the light of every star ever born. She wore robes that seemed woven from moonbeams, and when she moved, the very air around her sang. Tamati, son of Aroha. Her voice was like music, like the sound of the ocean meeting the shore, eternal and patient. Do you wish to die? He tried to speak, but his lips were frozen shut. He could only stare at her, wondering if this was death finally claiming him. She reached out and touched his chest, right over his heart, and warmth exploded through him. Not the warmth of fire, but something deeper, something that reached into his very soul and ignited that ember his mother had left there. You are not slave-born, she said softly. You are moon-blessed. Your mother was my priestess in a time before these petty alphas claimed dominion over my children. She died protecting you, hiding what you truly are until the time was right. What am I? Tamati managed to whisper, his voice cracking. You are my chosen king, the moon goddess said, and when she smiled, the whole world seemed to brighten. You are the one who will unite the packs, who will restore the old ways, who will remind my children that strength is not measured in cruelty but in compassion. But first you must survive this night. You must choose to live, even when death would be easier. Do you choose to live, Tamati? He should have been terrified. He should have thought it was a hallucination, a dying dream. But something in her words resonated with that ember in his chest, made it blaze into a full flame. Yes, he said. I choose to live. She leaned forward and kissed his forehead, and the world exploded into silver light. Pain unlike anything he'd ever experienced consumed him. His bones cracked and reformed. His spine arched. His skin rippled and sprouted fur. His face elongated into a muzzle. His hands became paws tipped with claws. He tried to scream, but what came out was a howl that shook the very mountains, a sound of pure power that echoed across the territories and made every wolf within 100 miles stop and listen in primal recognition. When the transformation completed, Tamati stood on 4 legs for the first time in his life. But this wasn't the typical wolf form of pack members. He was massive, easily twice the size of Alpha Rengi's wolf form. His fur was pure silver, luminescent in the moonlight, and when he opened his eyes, they blazed with silver fire. The ropes that had bound him lay in tatters on the ground. The post had splintered from the force of his transformation. And standing before him, solid now instead of translucent, the moon goddess smiled with satisfaction. Now run, my king, she said. Run north to the mountains. Seek the highland pack. Their alpha Wiremu will recognize what you are. He will shelter you while you learn to master your gifts. And when you are ready, you will return. You will face those who enslaved you. And you will show them that the moon's justice is absolute. Tamati wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but his new instincts were screaming at him to move. Already he could hear the pack stirring, woken by his howl. He had minutes, maybe seconds before they came for him. He ran. His new body moved with a grace and power he'd never imagined possible. He was fast, faster than any wolf should be. His silver paws barely touching the ground as he raced through the settlement. Wolves poured from the pack house, their eyes wide with shock and confusion. Who was this massive silver wolf? Where had it come from? Alpha Rengi emerged last. His own wolf form impressive but dwarfed by Tamati's size. Recognition flickered in the alpha's yellow eyes, followed immediately by rage and fear. Stop him! Rengi roared. Kill the slave. Kill him before he escapes. But Tamati was already gone, racing through the streets of Otapoti and into the forests beyond. Behind him, he heard the sounds of pursuit, Dozens of wolves giving chase, their howls filling the night with fury. But they couldn't catch him. Every stride took him farther from the only home he'd ever known, farther from the chains and the pain and the endless suffering. He ran until dawn broke over the mountains, painting the snow-capped peaks in shades of gold and rose. He ran until his pursuers gave up and turned back, unable to match his endurance. He ran until he collapsed in a clearing deep in the highlands, his silver fur matted with frost, his lungs burning, his heart hammering in his chest. And when he woke hours later, he was human again, naked and shivering but alive. More alive than he'd ever been. The Highland pack found him 3 days later, half-starved and delirious with fever. They brought him to their great hall, a massive structure carved into the mountainside itself, and laid him before their alpha. Wiremu was ancient, his human form showing at least 70 years. His hair white as snow but his eyes sharp as flint. He circled Tamati slowly, studying him with an intensity that would have been terrifying if Tamati had the energy to be afraid. "The moon's chosen," Wiremu finally said, his voice gravelly with age. "I thought I'd died before seeing this day. The old prophecies spoke of you, boy. Silver fur, silver eyes, born of suffering to bring salvation. Do you know what you are?" Tamati shook his head weakly. "I know what I was. Slave. I don't know what I am now." "You are the Moon King," Wiremu said, dropping to one knee before him. Around the hall, the other Highland wolves followed suit, kneeling before this broken, starved young man. "The Alpha of Alphas. The one who will restore balance to all packs. And I am sworn by ancient oath to serve you, to teach you, to prepare you for the trials ahead." Thus began Tamati's true education. The Highland pack, it turned out, were the keepers of the old ways, the guardians of traditions that stretched back centuries before the current packs rose to power. They remembered when wolves lived in harmony with humans, when alphas served their packs rather than ruling them, when the moon goddess walked freely among her children. Wiremu taught him to control his transformation, to shift at will rather than only under the full moon. It wasn't easy. The power that flowed through Tamati was immense, almost too much for his body to contain. The first dozen times he tried to shift, he only managed partial transformations. His body stuck painfully between human and wolf. But with patience and guidance he learned. He learned to harness his enhanced senses, to hear heartbeats from 100 yards away, to smell emotions in the sweat of nervous wolves, to see in complete darkness as clearly as day. He learned to fight in both forms, to use his size and strength strategically rather than relying on brute force alone. He learned the history of the packs, the political webs that connected and divided them, the feuds and alliances that shaped the territories. And he learned about the prophecy in detail. It had been foretold by the last true moon priestess, Tamati's great-great-grandmother, who had warned that the packs would fall into corruption and cruelty, enslaving their own kind and forgetting the moon's teachings. But from this darkness would rise a king, born of the lowest to lead the highest, rejected by the strong to become the strongest, chosen by the moon to restore her light. "The prophecy says you'll face 3 trials," Wiremu explained one night, as they sat by the fire in his private chambers. "The trial of pain, which you've already passed. They tried to break you your entire life, and you wouldn't break. The trial of power, which you're undergoing now. You must master your gifts without letting them corrupt you. And finally, the trial of choice, where you'll have to decide between vengeance and justice, between the easy path and the right one. What if I choose wrong?" Tamati asked. He was 18 now, his year in the highlands having added muscle to his frame and confidence to his bearing, but the scars of his past still haunted him. "Then you become what they were," Wiremu said simply. "A tyrant. Monster. The moon doesn't choose perfection, boy. She chooses potential. What you become is up to you." Tamati trained relentlessly. He pushed himself harder than any of the Highland warriors, rising before dawn and training until he collapsed at night. He learned not just combat but diplomacy, strategy, history, and law. Wiremu made him memorize the old codes, the laws that had governed packs in the ancient times, laws based on respect and mutual aid rather than domination. But at night, alone in the small chamber Wayarmu had given him, Tamati's thoughts always returned to Otapoti. He thought about the slaves still suffering there, about Marama and the others who had shown him kindness. He thought about Alpharengi and Hemi, about the casual cruelty they inflicted without a second thought. And he thought about revenge. Oh, how he thought about revenge. He imagined returning in his silver wolf form, tearing through the Crimson Fong pack like a storm, making them feel every moment of pain they'd inflicted on him. He imagined Rengi begging for mercy the way Tamati's mother had begged. He imagined Hemi's blood on his claws. These thoughts scared him. They felt too good, too righteous, too easy to justify. Was this the trial of choice that Wayarmu had mentioned? The decision between revenge and justice. One night, unable to sleep, Tamati climbed to the highest peak overlooking the highland territory. The moon was nearly full, her light painting the world in silver. He sat on a boulder and stared up at her, seeking the goddess who had transformed his life. "I don't know if I can do this," he said aloud. "I want to hurt them. I want to make them suffer like they made me suffer. Is that wrong? Does that make me unworthy?" The wind picked up, carrying a voice he'd heard only once before but would never forget. "It makes you mortal," the moon goddess said, her form materializing beside him, translucent but present. "Anger is not wrong, Tamati. Anger at injustice is right and proper. But what you do with that anger determines who you become." "I could kill them all," Tamati said, his hands clenching into fists. "With this power you gave me, I could destroy the entire Crimson Fong pack in a single night." "You could," she agreed. "And would that free the slaves? Or would it simply create a power vacuum that another tyrant would fill? Would it teach the other packs to be better? Or would it teach them that might makes right, that whoever has the most power gets to decide who lives and dies?" Tamati closed his eyes. "Then what do I do? How do I stop them without becoming them?" "You show them a better way," she said. "You don't just defeat them, Tamati. You transform them. You give them the chance to change, to grow, to become what they should have been all along. And if they refuse, if they choose cruelty over compassion, then you do what must be done. But you always offer the choice first. That's what makes a king rather than a tyrant." She faded away, leaving Tamati alone with his thoughts. He sat there until dawn, wrestling with concepts that would have seemed impossibly abstract just 2 years ago. Mercy, justice, redemption. They were easy words to say and desperately hard to practice. By the time he descended the mountain, he'd made his decision. He would return to Otapoti. He would face the Crimson Fong pack. But he would do it the right way or he'd die trying. Wayarmu wasn't surprised when Tamati announced his intention to leave. "I wondered when you'd feel ready," the old alpha said. "The question is, how will you approach this? Will you go alone? Will you take Highland warriors with you? Will you challenge Rengi to single combat? Or will you use strategy?" "I'm still deciding," Tamati admitted. "But I know I can't bring war to Otapoti. Too many innocents would die. The slaves, the children, the wolves who aren't responsible for Rengi's cruelty. This has to be surgical. Precise. Smart." Wayarmu nodded. "You're learning. A king's first duty is to protect the vulnerable, even when it would be easier to burn everything down and start fresh." They spent weeks planning. Tamati studied the Crimson Fong pack structure, their routines, their vulnerabilities. He learned that Rengi's power base was actually more fragile than it appeared. Many of the pack members privately despised the Alpha's brutality but lacked the courage or strength to oppose him. The slave system, it turned out, was deeply unpopular among many younger wolves who found it distasteful but felt powerless to change it. "There's your opening," Wayarmu said, pointing to the intelligence they'd gathered. "The pack is divided. Rengi rules through fear, which means the moment someone stronger appears, his support will crumble. You don't need to defeat the entire pack. You just need to defeat him and offer the others a better alternative." But there was a complication. Pack law was ancient and absolute. An outsider couldn't simply challenge an alpha and take over. The challenge had to come from within the pack, or it had to be sanctioned by the Council of Alphas, a gathering of all territorial pack leaders that occurred only once every 5 years. The next council is in 3 months, Wiremu said. That's when you make your move. I'll call for it to be held at Otapoti, on neutral ground. I'll bring the Highland Pack, and I'll invite the Coastal Reavers and the Silver Moon Pack. We'll force Rengi to answer for his crimes in front of all pack leadership. Will they come? Tamati asked. Why would they care about slaves or how one alpha runs his territory? Wiremu smiled grimly. Because Rengi has been expanding his territory, encroaching on fishing grounds and hunting lands. The Reavers are furious but haven't wanted to start a war. And the Silver Moon Pack? Well, they've been waiting for the Moon King to reveal himself. They'll come to witness whether you're truly who the prophecy says you are. The 3 months passed in a blur of final preparations. Tamati trained harder than ever, knowing that the confrontation would test every skill he'd learned. He studied rhetoric and debate, knowing that strength alone wouldn't win this battle. And he steeled his heart, knowing that facing Rengi and Hemi again would resurrect every trauma he'd suffered. The night before they left for Otapoti, Marama visited him in a dream. She looked younger than he remembered, healthy and whole, and she smiled at him with such love that his heart ached. "I'm so proud of you," she said. "Your mother would be so proud. You've become everything she knew you could be." "I'm scared," Tamati admitted. "What if I fail? What if I make things worse?" "Then you'll fail with honor," Marama said. "Better to try and fail than to live forever as a slave, whether to chains or to fear. You've already won, Tamati. You've already proven that slaves are not broken animals. We're wolves too. We just needed someone to remind us." When he woke, his face was wet with tears, but his resolve was iron. It was time to go home. The journey south took a week. Wiremu brought 50 of his best warriors, not as an invasion force but as honor guard for the council. They traveled slowly, deliberately, letting word of their approach spread ahead of them. By the time they reached the borders of Crimson Fong territory, every pack in the region knew that the Highland Alpha was coming, and he was bringing someone extraordinary with him. Rengi met them at the border, his own warriors flanking him, Hemi at his right hand. The Crimson Fong Alpha had aged visibly in 2 years. His hair grayer, his face harder. But his eyes still held that same cruel intelligence, that same casual disregard for anything weaker than himself. He didn't recognize Tamati at first. Why would he? The last time Rengi had seen him, he'd been a starving, naked slave tied to a post. Now Tamati stood tall and strong, dressed in the fine clothes of Highland nobility, radiating confidence and power. It wasn't until Tamati met his eyes that recognition flickered and Rengi's face went pale. "You," Rengi breathed. "Impossible. You died. You were supposed to die." "I did die," Tamati said quietly. "The slave died. But the Moon King was born. And I've come home, Alpha Rengi. We need to talk." The Council of Alphas convened 3 days later in the great hall that Tamati had once scrubbed on his hands and knees. 4 alphas gathered: Rengi of the Crimson Fong, Wiremu of the Highland Pack, Kara of the Coastal Reavers, and Anahara of the Silver Moon Pack. Anahara was the most striking, a woman of perhaps 40 with silver streaks in her black hair and eyes that seemed to see everything. She studied Tamati openly, her expression unreadable, before finally nodding once as if confirming something to herself. The hall was packed with witnesses. Pack members lined the walls, dozens of wolves from all territories, all here to see what would unfold. And in the back, barely visible in the shadows, Tamati saw them, the slaves. Marama was dead, he'd learned. She'd passed during the winter, worked literally to death. But others remained, and they watched him with desperate hope. Wiremu opened the proceedings. "We gather under the full moon, witnessed by all packs, to address matters that affect our collective honor. I bring accusations against Alpha Rengi of the Crimson Fong for violations of the old laws, specifically the enslavement of pack-born wolves and the murder of moon-blessed individuals. The hall erupted in murmurs. Rengi shot to his feet, his face purple with rage. "You overstep, Wiremu. How I manage my territory is my business. Not when it violates the old codes," Anahara said quietly, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Not when you enslave those who carry the moon's blessing. And especially not when you attempt to murder the Moon King himself." All eyes turned to Tamati. He felt the weight of their gazes, the skepticism, the curiosity, the hope, the fear. He stood slowly, his heart hammering but his voice steady. "I am Tamati, son of Aroha, priestess of the moon. I was born in your chains, Alpha Rengi. I was tortured, starved, beaten and left to die. You rejected me as worthless. But the moon saw worth in me. She chose me to restore balance, to remind all packs of what we're supposed to be." "Lies!" Hemi shouted. "He's a fraud. A slave pretending to be special. Father, let me kill him and end this farce." "By all means," Tamati said, his voice dropping to something cold and dangerous. "Try." The challenge hung in the air like electricity before a storm. Pack law was absolute. A challenge issued before the council could not be refused. Hemi grinned viciously, already beginning to shift, confident in his strength and skill. But Tamati was faster. He shifted in a blur of silver light, his massive wolf form materializing in the space between heartbeats. Hemi's grin faltered as he realized the size difference, but momentum carried him forward into the fight. It was over in seconds. Tamati moved with surgical precision, using his superior size and speed to control the fight completely. He didn't toy with Hemi. He didn't prolong his suffering. He simply ended it, his jaws closing around Hemi's throat and squeezing until the other wolf went limp. He didn't kill him. That was important. He could have easily, but instead he dropped the unconscious Hemi at Rengi's feet and shifted back to human form, standing naked and unashamed before the entire council. "I could have killed him," Tamati said. "Just like I could kill you, Rengi. Just like I could slaughter every wolf in this hall who has ever hurt a slave. But that's not justice. That's just revenge wearing a different name." He turned to address the full council. "The old ways taught us that strength should protect the weak, that alphas serve their packs, that the moon's blessing is given to all who carry wolf blood, regardless of birth. You've forgotten. All of you. You've let cruelty become normal, slavery become acceptable, might become right." "Pretty words," Rengi snarled. "But you're still just a slave playing dress-up. You have no authority here. No right to judge me." "He has every right," Anahara said, standing. "I am Anahara of the Silver Moon Pack, descended from the first moon priestesses. I have waited my entire life for the Moon King to reveal himself. And I recognize him now." She dropped to one knee before Tamati. "I pledge my pack to your service, Moon King. Command us, and we obey." Wiremu followed suit, kneeling. "The Highland Pack reaffirms our ancient oath. We serve the Moon King." Kara of the Coastal Reavers studied Tamati for a long moment before nodding and kneeling as well. "The Reavers recognize your authority. We will follow." Only Rengi remained standing, his face twisted with fury and fear. Around the hall, his pack members began to kneel, one by one, abandoning their alpha in favor of this silver-eyed newcomer who offered something they'd forgotten existed: hope for something better. "No!" Rengi roared. "I am alpha here. This is my territory. Mine." "Then challenge him," Anahara said coldly. "Invoke your right to single combat. Winner takes all." Rengi shifted, his wolf form impressive but dwarfed by Tamati's silver giant. They circled each other, and Tamati could see the calculation in Rengi's eyes. The old alpha was considering running, abandoning his territory rather than facing certain death. "I won't kill you," Tamati said quietly. "If you submit, if you swear to uphold the old laws and free every slave in your territory, I'll let you live. You can keep your position as alpha of this region, answering to me but maintaining your dignity. Or you can fight, and I will beat you, and you'll be exiled with nothing. Choose. It was the hardest thing Tamati had ever done, offering mercy to the monster who'd defined his suffering. Every instinct screamed for blood, for vengeance, for justice paid in pain. But the moon goddess's words echoed in his mind. Offer the choice. Give them the chance to change. Rengi stared at him for an endless moment. Then, slowly, the old alpha shifted back to human form and knelt. I submit, he said, his voice breaking. I swear to uphold the old laws. I free all slaves in my territory. I acknowledge you as Moon King. The hall erupted in cheers and howls, but Tamati felt no triumph. Only exhaustion and a strange, hollow sadness. He'd won. He'd passed all 3 trials. But victory tasted like ash in his mouth. In the weeks that followed, Tamati worked tirelessly to transform the Crimson Fong territory. The slaves were freed, given homes and positions within the pack hierarchy based on skill rather than birth. The punishment posts were torn down. The slave quarters were burned. New laws were written and enforced, based on the old codes but adapted for modern times. It wasn't easy. Decades of cruelty couldn't be undone overnight. Some former slaves struggled with their newfound freedom, unsure how to live without chains. Some free wolves resented losing their cheap labor and the power that came with it. There were conflicts, setbacks, moments when Tamati wondered if he'd bitten off more than he could chew. But slowly, painfully, things improved. The territory became prosperous as former slaves contributed their talents freely rather than under the whip. Artists emerged, creating beautiful works that decorated the Great Hall. Healers who'd hidden their knowledge for fear of being worked harder now shared it openly, improving health across the entire pack. Hunters who'd been denied training proved naturally gifted, bringing in more game than the territory had seen in years. Tamati established his seat of power not in Odapoti, but in the mountains between all territories, in a place the old ones had called Te Wai Punamu, the waters of greenstone. He built a new great hall there, designed not as a fortress but as a gathering place, with rooms for all packs to meet as equals. It became known as the Hall of Silver Light, and wolves traveled from across the territories to seek his counsel. His reputation grew. Stories spread of the slave who became king, of the moon's chosen who offered mercy to his tormentors, of the silver wolf whose howl could be heard from the mountains to the sea. Other territories, hearing of the changes in Crimson Fong lands, began questioning their own practices. Some alphas resisted, clinging to the old brutalities, but pressure from their own pack members forced changes. The Highland pack remained his strongest ally. Wiremu served as his chief advisor until the old alpha's death 3 years later, passing peacefully in his sleep with a smile on his face. His successor, a young warrior named Tama, swore the same oaths and maintained the alliance. Anahara of the Silver Moon Pack became something more than an ally. She was the only one who truly understood the burden of being moon-touched, of carrying the goddess's expectations. They spent long nights talking about prophecy and duty, about the weight of transforming an entire culture. She never pushed for anything romantic, and Tamati was grateful. He wasn't ready for that. Maybe he never would be. The scars of his past ran too deep. The coastal reavers, under Kara's leadership, proved surprisingly progressive. They'd always valued skill over birth in their fishing and raiding operations, so adapting to merit-based hierarchies came naturally. Kara and Tamati developed a genuine friendship, bonding over their shared appreciation for direct action and practical solutions. Even Rengi changed, though slowly and incompletely. The old alpha kept his word, enforcing the new laws without complaint, but Tamati could see the resentment simmering beneath. Rengi had lost face, lost power, lost everything that had defined him. He went through the motions of reformation, but his heart wasn't in it. Still he obeyed, and that was enough for now. Hemi was another story. The former heir nursed his humiliation like a poisonous wound. Stripped of his position, reduced to common pack member status, he watched Tamati with eyes full of hatred. Tamati kept watch on him, assigning trustworthy wolves to report on his movements. Hemi was planning something. The question was what and when. The answer came 2 years into Tamati's reign as Moon King. A group of disaffected wolves from various territories, led by Hemi, staged what they called the Restoration, an attempt to return to the old ways of might makes right and hierarchies based on birth. They attacked one of the smaller villages on the Crimson Fong border, killing the local elder and attempting to re-enslave the free wolves there. Tamati's response was swift and devastating. He led a force of warriors from all 4 major packs, a united front that had never existed before in living memory. They surrounded Hemi's rebels in a valley near what the colonizers called Queenstown, cutting off all escape routes. But instead of attacking immediately, Tamati walked into the valley alone, in human form, unarmed. "I'm giving you one chance," he called out to the rebels. "Lay down your weapons. Return to your packs. Face justice under the new laws, which means trials and fair punishment, not execution. Or fight me now, and I promise you won't survive." Most of the rebels surrendered immediately. They joined Hemi out of frustration or fear, not genuine commitment to his cause. But Hemi himself refused, along with a core group of about 20 die-hard supporters. "You're a fraud," Hemi screamed, shifting into his wolf form. "A slave pretending to be a king. Today we restore the natural order." They attacked in a coordinated rush, 20 wolves against 1. It should have been suicide for Tamati. It would have been if he were any normal wolf. But he was the Moon King, blessed by the goddess herself, and when he shifted into his massive silver form, the very ground seemed to tremble beneath his paws. The moon, though not full, blazed brighter in the sky, as if the goddess herself was watching. The fight was brutal but brief. Tamati's size and strength were overwhelming, but more than that was his speed and skill. Years of training with Wiremu had taught him to fight smart, to use leverage and timing rather than relying on brute force alone. He disabled wolves rather than killing them, breaking legs and crushing paws, making them unable to fight without ending their lives. Until he reached Hemi. The former heir fought with desperate fury, all technique abandoned in favor of berserker rage. He landed several hits, his claws opening wounds in Tamati's silver fur, drawing blood that glowed faintly in the moonlight. But rage without discipline was just wasted energy. Tamati waited for his opening and took it, his jaws closing around Hemi's throat just as they had years ago in the Great Hall. This time Hemi didn't go limp. He struggled, choking, dying. Tamati could have ended it. Should have ended it, probably. Hemi had proven he'd never change, never accept the new order, never stop trying to kill Tamati and everything he'd built. Executing him would be justice, would be smart, would be merciful to all the future victims Hemi would claim if allowed to live. But Tamati released him. He stepped back, shifted to human form, and stood over Hemi's gasping wolf body. "I could kill you," Tamati said quietly. "The goddess knows you deserve it. But I'm not going to. Because the moment I start executing wolves for opposing me, I become what Rengi was. A tyrant who rules through fear and violence. So instead you're exiled. You and anyone who still follows you. Leave these territories and never return. If you do, there won't be a third chance." It was perhaps the hardest decision of his reign. Many argued against it, including Anahara and Kara. They said Hemi was too dangerous to release, that mercy to the cruel was cruelty to the innocent. And they weren't wrong. But Tamati had made his choice, had decided what kind of king he would be, and he had to live with it. Hemi and his remaining supporters left that very night, heading east toward the territories beyond the mountains where the old brutal ways still held sway. Tamati watched them go with a heavy heart, wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake. But the effect on the other wolves was profound. The story spread quickly. The Moon King had defeated a rebellion without executing a single wolf. He'd shown mercy even to those who'd tried to kill him. It wasn't weakness, the story said. It was strength of a different kind, the strength to hold to principles even when it was hard, even when it hurt. More territories began requesting to join his confederation. Alphas from distant lands sent envoys, asking about these new old ways, wondering if they could work in their own packs. Tamati sent teachers, wolves trained in the reformed laws and practices, to help other territories transition. Not everyone accepted. Some alphas clung to their power, and Tamati refused to force the issue. He wouldn't become a conqueror, imposing his will on unwilling packs. The change had to come from within, or it wouldn't last. 5 years into his reign, Tamati received word that changed everything. Hemi had returned, not with an army, but alone and in chains, dragged by a group of wolves from the eastern territories. They brought him to the Hall of Silver Light and threw him at Tamati's feet. He tried to start a slave trade in our lands, their leader, a grizzled alpha named Paki, explained. Kidnapping free wolves and selling them to the highest bidder. We caught him red-handed. Our laws say he should be executed, but we heard that he came from your territories originally. We thought you should have the final say. Hemi looked up at Tamati with eyes full of hate and something else. Desperation. He knew he was going to die. The only question was how painfully. Tamati stared at him for a long moment, feeling nothing but weary sadness. Why? He asked. Why can't you change? Why do you cling so hard to cruelty? Because it's what we are, Hemi spat. Wolves. Predators. The strong dominate the weak. That's nature. Your way is a lie, a fantasy that makes you feel good but ignores reality. No, Tamati said quietly. Wolves are also pack animals. We survive through cooperation, through protecting each other, through working together. Yes, we're predators, but we're not monsters. We don't have to be. He turned to Paki. Your laws say execution. I won't override that. You caught him in your territory breaking your laws. Justice is yours to dispense. But I ask that you make it quick and clean. No torture. No spectacle. Just justice. Paki nodded grimly. They took Hemi outside, and moments later, a howl cut short signaled the end of the former heir. Tamati didn't watch. He'd learned that being king meant making hard choices, and sometimes the hardest choice was knowing when mercy had reached its limit. That night, alone in his chambers, he wept. Not for Hemi specifically, but for the waste of it all. For the lives destroyed by cruelty and fear. For the potential that had been squandered. For the young wolf Hemi might have been if he'd been raised differently, taught differently, loved differently. The moon goddess appeared to him then, as she did occasionally in moments of crisis. She sat beside him on his bed, solid and warm and real, and took his hand. You did well, she said softly. Better than I hoped. You've transformed these territories, given wolves hope they'd forgotten existed. You've passed every trial I set before you. Then why does it hurt so much? Tamati asked, wiping tears from his face. Why does victory feel like losing? Because you have a heart, she said. Because you care about every wolf, even the ones who hate you. That's why you were chosen, Tamati. Not because you're perfect, but because you're compassionate. Not because you never fail, but because you keep trying even when it's hard. I miss my mother, he whispered. I miss Marama. I miss being nobody, having no responsibilities, no weight of expectation. I know, the goddess said, pulling him close. Leadership is lonely. Power is heavy. But look at what you've built. Look at the free wolves walking with their heads high, the children playing without fear, the territories learning to work together instead of tearing each other apart. You did that. You, the slave they left to die on a post. He cried harder, finally letting out years of grief and trauma and stress. She held him through it all, patient and eternal as the moon itself, until he had no tears left. What happens now? He finally asked. Where do we go from here? Forward, she said simply. Always forward. There will be more challenges, more difficult choices, more moments when you question everything. But you'll face them as you faced everything else. With courage, compassion, and the certainty that every wolf deserves dignity. She faded away as dawn broke, leaving Tamati alone but somehow less lonely. He rose, washed his face, dressed in his ceremonial robes, and went to face another day of being king. 10 years passed. The Confederation grew to encompass 12 major territories, each maintaining their autonomy but bound by common laws and mutual defense pacts. Slavery became not just illegal but unthinkable, a shameful relic of a darker time. Young wolves grew up not knowing the fear that had defined their parents' lives. Tamati aged gracefully, his silver hair appearing early but his strength never waning. He never took a mate, never produced heirs, though many offered. Some whispered about it, wondering if the Moon King was somehow broken by his traumatic youth. But those close to him understood. He'd given everything to his people, had nothing left for romance or family. Perhaps that was sad. Perhaps it was noble. Perhaps it was both. He established schools where young wolves learned the old ways, the moon's teachings, the importance of compassion alongside strength. He created councils where disputes could be resolved through dialogue rather than combat. He commissioned the building of monuments to honor those who died as slaves, ensuring their suffering would never be forgotten. And every full moon, he climbed to the highest peak and howled, his voice carrying across all the territories, a reminder that the Moon King watched over them still. Rengi died in the 12th year of Tamati's reign, old age finally claiming him. To Tamati's surprise, the former Alpha's final words, delivered by a messenger, were, "Tell him I understand now. Tell him I'm sorry." Tamati wept at that news too. Not because he'd loved Rengi, but because it meant change was possible, that even the cruelest heart could soften, that redemption was real. By the 15th year, Tamati's hair had gone completely silver, matching his wolf fur. He was only 32, but the stress of leadership had aged him prematurely. His body was covered in scars, some from his slave days, others from the various conflicts and challenges he'd faced as king. He wore them with quiet pride, proof that suffering didn't have to destroy you, that pain could forge strength rather than breaking it. One evening, as he sat alone in the Hall of Silver Light reviewing reports from distant territories, Anahara entered unannounced. She was older too, her black hair now more silver than dark, but her eyes remained sharp and knowing. "You're going to work yourself to death," she observed, settling into the chair across from him. "Better than being useless," he replied, not looking up from his papers. "Tamati." Her voice was gentle but firm. "When was the last time you shifted for pleasure rather than necessity? When did you last run just to feel the wind in your fur? When did you last do something that wasn't for the good of the territories?" He paused, realizing he couldn't remember. "There's too much to do. The eastern territories are still unstable. The southern pacts are having border disputes. We'll still be there tomorrow," she interrupted. "The territories survived thousands of years before you. They'll survive a night without you micromanaging them. Come with me." She stood and walked toward the door, not waiting to see if he'd follow. After a moment's hesitation, he did. She led him outside into the forest, stripping off her clothes without ceremony and shifting into her wolf form. She was beautiful, her fur silver-black like her hair, her movements graceful and sure. She looked at him expectantly. Tamati shifted, feeling his bones reshape. His senses explode into hyper-awareness. It had been weeks since his last transformation, he realized. Maybe months. He'd been so focused on administrative duties that he'd neglected the most fundamental part of himself. Anahara took off running and he followed. They raced through the forests, leaping over streams, dodging between trees, howling at the moon just for the joy of it. For the first time in years, Tamati felt truly free, unburdened by responsibility or expectation. He was just a wolf, running wild under the stars. They ran until exhaustion claimed them, collapsing in a clearing high in the mountains. They shifted back to human form, lying side by side in the grass, staring up at the infinite stars. "Thank you," Tamati said quietly. "I needed that." "I know," Anahara replied. "You're a good king, Tamati. Maybe the best we've ever had. But you're also still mortal. You need rest." "Oi." Moments that aren't about duty. I don't know how, he admitted. I spent so long just surviving, and then I spent even longer trying to fix everything. I don't know how to just be. Learn, she said. Start small. Take one evening a week to do something just for yourself. Run. Read. Sit and watch the sunset. Whatever feeds your soul instead of draining it. What if something happens? What if they need me? Then they'll find you, she said pragmatically. You're not responsible for solving every problem instantly. Trust your advisors. Trust your fellow alphas. Trust that the system you've built is strong enough to function without you hovering over every detail. He knew she was right. He'd built an entire administrative structure specifically so he wouldn't have to personally handle everything. But letting go was hard. Control was the only thing that had kept him alive as a slave, the only thing that had gotten him through those brutal years. Releasing it felt dangerous. But he was tired, so profoundly tired. And lying there under the stars, with Anahara beside him and the moon watching over them both, he made a decision. Okay, he said. I'll try. One evening a week just for me. No council meetings, no reports, no crisis management. Just being Tamati instead of the Moon King. Good, Anahara said, smiling. Because I'm holding you to that. And if you break your promise, I'm dragging you out here again by force if necessary. They lay there in comfortable silence until dawn, then made their way back to the Hall of Silver Light. Tamati felt lighter somehow, as if acknowledging his limitations had lifted a weight he hadn't known he was carrying. The years continued to pass. The Confederation grew stronger, more stable. New generations of wolves came of age knowing only freedom, only the reformed ways. The stories of the slave days became history, still taught but increasingly distant, less real to those who hadn't lived through them. Tamati kept his promise to Anahara. Every week he took time for himself. Sometimes he ran. Sometimes he read. Sometimes he just sat on his favorite mountain peak and watched the world turn. Those moments of peace sustained him through the difficulties that continued to arise. Because difficulties always arose. There were still wolves who resented the new ways, still territories that resisted reform, still conflicts that required his attention. But they were manageable now. Problems to be solved rather than crises to be survived. On the 20th anniversary of his transformation, the packs threw a massive celebration. Wolves from every territory gathered at Te Waipunamu, filling the Hall of Silver Light and spilling out into the surrounding mountains. They feasted and danced and told stories, celebrating not just Tamati but everything they'd built together. Tamati sat at the high table, watching it all with quiet satisfaction. Former slaves danced with former masters, all distinctions of birth forgotten in favor of merit and character. Children played together regardless of pack affiliation, their laughter echoing through the hall. Young warriors sparred playfully, showing off for the watching crowd. This was what he'd fought for. Not revenge against his tormentors, though that had been tempting. Not power for its own sake, though he wielded more than any alpha before him. But this, the simple joy of wolves living freely, without fear, without chains, without the casual cruelty that had once defined their world. The moon goddess appeared beside him, visible only to his eyes, and smiled with satisfaction. Well done, my king, she said softly. You've exceeded every expectation. You've transformed not just laws but hearts. That's the hardest magic of all. I had help, he replied. Wairmu, Anahara, Kara, even Rengi in his own strange way. The free wolves who risked everything to support change. The former slaves who found the courage to claim their freedom. I didn't do this alone. No, she agreed. That's what makes it real. Change imposed from above is tyranny. Change embraced from within is transformation. You understood that instinctively, and it's why your reforms will last long after you're gone. Am I dying? He asked, more curious than afraid. Eventually, she said. All mortal things do. But not yet. You have years left, decades probably. Your body is strong, your mind sharp. You'll see grandchildren born to those children playing below, Watch the territories you unified grow even stronger. You'll face new challenges, solve new problems, continue to grow and change yourself. Good, he said. Because there's still so much to do. The territories beyond the mountains still practice slavery. The coastal regions are developing new trade routes that could either unite or divide us. Always working, she said fondly, shaking her head. Some things never change. But yes, there's always more to do. That's the nature of leadership. You'll never reach a point where everything is perfect and you can rest on your laurels. But that's okay. Perfection isn't the goal. Progress is. And you've made more progress than anyone imagined possible. She faded away as the celebration reached its crescendo, leaving Tamati alone with his thoughts and his people. He stood, raising his cup, and the hall fell silent. 20 years ago, he said, his voice carrying to every corner, I was a slave awaiting death on a post in Otapoti. I had no name, no future, no hope. I was nothing in the eyes of those who claimed dominion over me. He paused, letting the words sink in. But the moon saw me. She saw worth where others saw worthlessness. She saw strength where others saw weakness. She saw a king where others saw a slave. And she gave me a chance to prove that birth doesn't determine destiny, that suffering doesn't have to break us, that change is possible if we have the courage to pursue it. He raised his cup higher. But I didn't change this world alone. You did. Every wolf who questioned the old brutalities, who stood up for compassion even when it was easier to look away, who chose mercy over cruelty, who believed that a better way was possible. You changed this world. I was just the catalyst. You were the transformation. The hall erupted in howls and cheers, wolves stamping their feet and clapping their hands. Tamati felt tears prick his eyes again, but these were good tears, happy tears, tears of profound gratitude for the journey that had brought him here. So tonight we celebrate not just me but all of us, he continued. We celebrate freedom. We celebrate unity. We celebrate the truth that every wolf, regardless of birth or status, deserves dignity and respect. And we commit ourselves to carrying these truths forward, to teaching them to our children, to spreading them to territories that haven't yet learned them. We commit to being worthy of the moon's blessing today and always. He drained his cup, and the celebration resumed with even greater intensity. Wolves danced and sang until dawn, until the moon set and the sun rose, painting the mountains in gold and rose, heralding a new day in a new world. Tamati stood at the entrance to the Hall of Silver Light, watching the sunrise, feeling at peace in a way he'd never quite managed before. He'd been born a slave. He'd been rejected by an alpha. He'd been left to die in the cold and dark. But the moon had chosen him, had seen something in that broken, suffering boy that no one else could see, had transformed him from victim to victor, from slave to king, from powerless to powerful. And he'd used that power not for revenge, but for redemption. Not to destroy his enemies, but to give them the chance to become better. Not to rule through fear but to lead through example. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever was. There were still problems to solve, still wolves who resented him, still territories that rejected his reforms. He still carried scars, both physical and emotional, that would never fully heal. He still had nightmares sometimes, waking in a cold sweat, feeling phantom chains around his wrists. But he was free, truly free. Not just physically but emotionally and spiritually. He'd broken the chains others had placed on him, and more importantly, he'd broken the chains he'd placed on himself. The chains of hatred, of bitterness, of the desire for vengeance that would have destroyed him as surely as Rengi's cruelty had. As the sun climbed higher, painting the world in brilliant light, Tamati, son of Aroha, former slave and current moon king, smiled. He had no idea what challenges tomorrow would bring. But he knew he'd face them as he'd faced everything else, with courage, compassion, and the absolute certainty that every wolf, no matter how low they'd fallen, deserved the chance to rise. If this story touched your heart, if you believe in second chances and the power of compassion over cruelty, subscribe now and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment telling me which part moved you most. And remember,